Welcome to Independent Truths with Scott Atlas, my podcast that tries to bring a rational perspective and sort out some of the most controversial issues of today. I'm pleased to have as a guest the Most Reverend Salvatore Cordileone, who is the Archbishop of San Francisco. He was appointed Archbishop back in 2012 after attending public schools and graduating from San Diego's Crawford High School and then the University of San Diego with a BA in philosophy. He then studied in Rome and back in the U.S. to complete a doctoral degree at Gregorian University and has gone on to be quite an outspoken person, very importantly here in the San Francisco Bay Area, on very important and traditional issues relevant to Catholicism, but also to contemporary life, including the definition of marriage, religious freedom, of course, particularly during the pandemic. We'll be talking about some of these many issues, including bringing us his perspective on the importance to society of religion today, and where do we go from here in a time of relative crisis, really, where there's been a loss of anchor of morality and an ethical life. Very important, of course, particularly in the heterogeneous society that we live in. So thanks for joining us and stay tuned. Okay, welcome, Archbishop Cordileone. Great to see you again.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
I thought I would start with diving right into things. You've been very outspoken as the Archbishop of San Francisco about many things, pro-life views, defining marriage as a union between a man and a woman, as well as focusing on other issues that are very important in San Francisco, particularly today, including the homeless population. For instance, you offered a requiem mass for homeless people who have died. You said at one point that the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, who is a San Francisco Democrat and says she's a Catholic, shouldn't receive communion because of her staunch political support for abortion. And when questioned about that, you cited Pope Francis, who always reminds bishops like yourself, quote, to think and speak as pastors, not politicians. I'm not a Catholic, but I don't find your positions very controversial, given that you are a Catholic in the priesthood and an archbishop, a very prominent person in Catholicism. So I'm sort of confused about why your views are viewed as controversial, and perhaps you can shed light on maybe what that says about the state of religion today, or even American culture in a broader sense.
My goodness, there's a lot to say there. Each one of those, there's so much to unpack in each one of those that you brought up. But
I mean, I'm shocked. I have to say before you start, I'm shocked that your views as a Catholic priest are controversial. And maybe you can, I think it says something that people are shocked by a Catholic priest saying traditional views that are inherent to Catholicism.
The views themselves are controversial in society. And that gets to your last question about what did this say about the state of our society. The views themselves, I don't think, are controversial within the church. There may be some people, but my sense is more the being outspoken about them may cause some people to feel uncomfortable. But, you know, this is a challenge the church has dealt with from time immemorial, that when it's in conflict with the kind of predominating values of a society, what is the reaction? You know, there's some within the church that would want to try to cooperate, go along, do as much as they can, and others who would be stronger in resisting. And to be honest, my inclination is always to try to come to some mutual consensus or an agreement or figure out a solution and try to cooperate. But
Right.
I think getting to this point that the state of society is so bad now and so intolerant that even these basic ideas like protecting life in the womb, or that marriage being for the good of a child to be able to be connected with the child's mother and father, they're controversial in the society, and there's even resistance among people of faith to want to strongly advocate for these things. Says a lot about the sort of intolerant state of our society, and almost, I would say, irrational, as you said, a leader of a religious community such as the Catholic religion. Many others share these same values of ours. It shouldn't be controversial, but I think there's also a problem in our society of people being judged by a stereotype. The media kind of creates an image, and then they're judged by that stereotype rather than getting to actually know the person. So I've been working at this a lot for a long time, certainly since I've been in San Francisco and even before, to help people get to know me. And I get to know people, so I'm not going to be so judgmental of other people either. So I think it doesn't necessarily change our opinion on things, but it does help to create a more civil society if we try to understand the humanity of the other person, even though they hold a view that I might sharply disagree with.
Yes, and I think you touch on so many things because I agree. There is a lack of tolerance for even the discussion of views that people may disagree with, and it often has turned into, over the past several years, I think we've seen this, a lack of civility is a way that I talk about it. The civil discussion of differences seems to be disappearing here. And I think that this was exacerbated to some extent by the pandemic and the stresses of society, and also by a lack of leadership. And we can talk about that a little later. But let's make a transition to talking about your personal story on the pandemic. You're a leader of a very important faith in this country, and certainly during a panic, during a time of crisis, during a time of fear and fear about death, to me, just looking at it in a logical way, that's the time where people need their faith. And yet there was a clear move to stop the practice of religion. Maybe you could enlighten our listeners and review what happened in your area of the country here.
Oh, thank you for that opportunity. Yes, this became very disturbing to me, what we experienced. Because, like I said, like most other leaders in my faith, in a way, we want to cooperate with government leaders and community leaders to care for the good of our people. And when the pandemic was first starting, and it looked like they were talking about this shelter in place, there was much we didn't know about it. There was uncertainty, there was fear. So we voluntarily suspended our public worship services and dispensed people from going to church on Sunday before everything totally shut down, because we're trying to be responsible and cooperative. As you will recall, you more than anyone, the original idea was 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and then we could begin to emerge. But then this went on and on and on, and I began to notice how others were being allowed to open up and to resume activities, and we were being kept shut down. So for example, after the George Floyd incident, when there was all the street protests, I asked, well, why can't we have our religious services outside? We can keep people 6 feet apart. And they were allowing people to go into the parks. And when I asked that, I was told that, well, in the parks, they have those circles. People stay inside the circles from the same household, and they're 6 feet apart. I said, well, we can mark our outdoor space. Our services are the people are stationary, so we can make sure they stay 6 feet apart outside. And he said, well, but you can't convene people to an event, even if it's outside. Well, the street protests were going on, and it was being published online when and where they were taking place. There was a limit of 12, And there were way more than 12 people at these street protests. They weren't consistently 6 feet apart. The city not only allowed it, the city participated in it. They used
in the protests.
Hall. They used the city podium. The mayor spoke at one of them. And yet we're confined to 12, and that was already a concession in May. So in San Francisco in May, religious worship services were still forbidden, but they asked houses of worship to submit a safety plan, which we had one. A little after that was scientifically proven to be effective. This was in May
of 2020.
May of 2020. Things started opening up. Then I was contacted by the mayor's office in the middle of May, and I was told that the reproduction rate, I believe it's called, how many people one infects if one is infected.
Of the virus, yes.
Yes. So it was at 0.96. And I was told it's been holding for 2 weeks under 1. If it stays under 1 for 2 more weeks, we'll be able to resume worship. Well, it stayed at 0.96 for the next 2 weeks. And for us, it was Pentecost Sunday was the last day of the month of May. So that's an important day for us as Christians. So we could return then. Well, then toward the end of the month, I was told that even though it held at 0.96, they needed more time just to be sure. And I asked, well, what more did they learn? Well, they didn't say. They said, well, they want to make sure they don't overrun the hospitals. I knew the hospitals were not being overrun because of a parishioner of ours who works in the hospital. I knew that they weren't being overrun. But he said, but for sure, now at this point, there was no worship allowed at all. He said, for sure, by the middle of May, according to the city health order. So I told my priest to get ready. We had our safety plan. He said, get ready. We may have to make modifications depending on the city's health order. Well, the city's health order, it did, yes, resume in the middle of June, but this is when they limited it to 12 people and only outside. However, it's allowed to live stream a service inside a house of worship, and you can have as many people there as you need to live stream and conduct the service up to 12. I thought, okay. Well, what's that? You mean the virus knows that people are inside of church to attend a service or to live stream it?
It's a very smart virus. You can't underestimate the intelligence of the virus.
Yes. So then I was starting to be cited as being out of compliance with the health order because I told my priest to leave the churches open during the day. For in our churches, there's sacred space for private prayer as well as a worship service. So I said, at least for people to have access to a sacred space. Well, I was being accused of violating the health order. And I found out people were spying on our churches. They would notify the city attorney, and then I'd get cited by him. He'd email me a letter or something like that, and then it get reported in the newspaper. In one case, after he sent me a letter, our legal counsel, 1 hour after I received the letter, received a phone call from a reporter asking about the letter. Well, obviously, we had a copy of the letter because of the questions that were being asked. So this sort of thing continued for a while. I met with the mayor in the middle of July, and I asked why at this point they were letting the stores go back into operation. Stores had submitted a safety plan. They got approved, and 50% capacity and other safety measures. I said, you never responded to our safety plan. We sent them back in May, and ours has been proven to work. And why can they go to a store and not into a church? And the health officer told me that, when you go to a store, you make a purchase and you leave, so you're not in there for very long. The problem is when people stay inside or an extended period of time, the virus circulates and it's higher risk of infection. And I said, well, yes, in a convenience store, but not in a department store. People can spend an hour, 2 hours in a department store, maybe even 3 hours. They're moving around, they're touching things. Whereas our services, the people are stationary. We keep them 6 feet apart. When they come up for communion, we can make sure they stay 6 feet apart. We can distribute communion safely. We have ways of doing this. It's been proven. The only response I got is, it's much safer to do it outdoors.
Yeah, I'll tell you what your mistake was. Your mistake was you believed in facts and logic and common sense. And you also didn't, you didn't understand that the rules were so arbitrary and poorly thought out and based on nothing. And it's very, I joke about it, but it's actually very serious because I mentioned this before and I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. Throughout a pandemic, you could make the case that in a situation like that, there is no greater need for access to religion, to faith, to all the things that people get out of religion in their lives, including people who are not very religious, but who just needed it at the time of stress. I mean, this seems to be one of the most egregious violations of civil liberties, not just simply technically, but in a bigger sense of simple human decency. I'd like to hear your thoughts on the loss of religious freedom in a time of great need, and also why do you think it was that many people can draw the conclusion that it was churches and religious practice that was somehow singled out, as opposed to stores, grocery stores, a variety of other venues?
Certainly people need faith more than ever at a time of a pandemic, and they need to be with their fellow believers. This is what really disturbed me, because all government officials I spoke with here in San Francisco and the state of California agreed with that. They affirmed what we're trying to do and the importance of faith, and they're trying to make it work. But yet they kept us shut down, and they acknowledged the harms that people were suffering with the loss, with the difficulty in practicing there, and the mental illness, the increased anxiety and domestic violence, drug overdoses and suicide. And they were concerned about that, but yet they kept us locked out of our worship. And I mean, at one point when I met with the health office, this was in June, so we were toward the end of June, so it was 12 people only outdoors. And I was complaining because they were letting others go into operation. And he said that, he had this 2-phase plan for 2 more weeks at 12, and then we can expand it after that if nothing unforeseen happens, such as an earthquake. He said that literally, such as an earthquake. This was on Tuesday. On Monday of that week, the day before, they noticed it was starting to increase. So they already knew there was a slight increase in the infection rate, and it continued to. So by the end of the week, this is a long story, it kept changing every day, and sometimes within a day what was going to happen. At the end of the week, they said, no, they can't reopen. But what he told me was this 2-phase approach, and then he said, I give you, the exact quote, I give you my word, I'm absolutely committed to making this work. And then he kept us shut down. The story that's later on, in the middle of July, he was on the meeting I had with the mayor by Zoom, and he said it's much safer to go outside. So this was really disturbing me, because they're affirming what we're saying about people need to practice their faith. They need access to their faith community, all the mental harm, mental illness it's causing. And yet, at the end, they didn't care.
Right, because ultimately
they did not care about the welfare of their people. They cared about controlling us.
And they were making arbitrary, bizarre, completely irrational judgments based on nothing. And, I have to say, it's very frustrating, but it's far worse than that. We have people in charge who are really not smart people. And the definition of smart to me is to be able to use critical thinking. They're not interested in the good of the people. They have other interests. I don't know what they are, because it's almost inexplicable. And finally, my sort of general feeling about people is that you judge them on their actions, not their words. So while it doesn't surprise me that they said, they were all in agreement with what you were saying and the importance of it, etc., the only thing that counts is what they did, frankly, at least in my view. And I think we have a lot in common the way we look at things, you and I, over the times that we've spoken about things. But I think it's rather obvious that actions hate to be trite, but actions speak louder than words. Do you think that there was a singling out of shutting down religion? And I'm asking that for also the sense and the documented data that there's been a marked increase in recent years on attacks on churches, including, but not only on Catholic churches. And I think this is a very, very concerning, statement about American culture. So if you agree that the churches were sort of singled out, is it simply because the people in charge are not very religious? Or is there something more, and that is, is religion even more marginalized today, at least by people in power or by a vocal group of people?
Well, religion is seen as marginal. It's seen as something, it's seen as a hobby. It's not part of the fabric of our society anymore. And I don't know if at first there was a explicit desire to shut down religion. It could be that they just thought, well, remember they were deciding what is essential and what is not. Here we are.
Right.
Where does the government have the authority to say one person's activity is essential and the other is not? I acknowledge they have authority to tell us what we have to do to protect for public safety. But they should issue those health orders, and then if people can conduct their business in accordance with it, do so. But they're getting on their high horse and saying you're essential and you're not.
Exactly. I often asked in that same line. I often asked, aren't schools an essential business of the United States because they shut down schools? And similarly, isn't the practice of religion an essential part of life for an enormous percentage of
And the problem
Americans?
with the issue of religion is government has no business here to begin with. Government also doesn't have the right to say religion is essential.
That's right.
Separation of church and state, which we know is not in the Constitution, the concept is there, means that government stays out of the church's business and the church doesn't run the government. So, there's some intersection here. As faith leaders, we have to be a voice of conscience. We have to provide moral guidance for the policies of our society, of our government. And, the government has a right, like I said, to tell us how to protect people. But the government has no right to say we are not essential. It can't issue a health order that's so restrictive as to, in fact, ban public worship. But I think they just saw, marijuana dispensaries were essential. Worship services were not in their mind. Here in San Francisco, as time dragged on and I was getting resistant, we were being targeted. Like I said, they were spying on our churches, reporting to the city attorney. Then it'd be written about in the newspaper. I started
this is very, very concerning to me, this idea, and it was true throughout the United States and many countries, that individuals were spying on and reporting their fellow citizens. This is exactly there is nothing different about that than what we saw in Nazi Germany or in the Stasi of East Germany and the secret police, where individuals were turned against each other and reporting their neighbors and friends to be arrested. I think this is one of the darkest turns, certainly of my lifetime, what we've seen in the United States with this. It is bigger than religion and religious targeting, but there was a mentality here that this is the lack of human civility, the lack of human decency, the lack of kindness to your fellow man. And I just think this is a very, very dangerous part of our society. In a bigger picture, you said religion is now viewed as a hobby, as it's been marginalized, and of course that there's no doubt about that. I wonder if it's even bigger than that, though, and that is, I think we are all witnessing an attack by a certain population of people on all traditional values that defined this country, the success of Western civilization. And the effect of that, of course, to tear down and destroy the traditional values is to make people dependent on something bigger, but that bigger entity is only a centralized government, really. There is no other anchor of personal morality or human decency. What do you think about that kind of discussion?
Oh yeah, I do. I think there's a secular belief system that is its own religion. It has the markings of a religion. It has infallible dogmas, for example, that it's forcing on the populace. It punishes dissenters. It has its rituals and its saints and martyrs. So it has these markings of a religion, and it's forcing and it's allowing no space for other beliefs. So these encroachments on religious freedom, we have organizations or institutions, of the famous Little Sisters of the Poor case. They're requiring a group of nuns who give up everything, forsake all worldly pursuits, vow themselves to a life of poverty in order to serve the elderly poor. They're being required to cover contraception in their insurance policy. The adoption agencies, our own Catholic Charities adoption agencies, have been run out of business. They had to shut down because they look for families with the intact family, mother and father, to place the children. And if they don't put them in other situations, then they can't operate. So there's no room for. And then of course we have the individual business people, the florists, the photographers, and so forth. That the bakers, right, that have been sued for not affirming really what is the belief of this secular system of belief. So these restrictions have been, and then during, as you said, it was sort of exacerbated or exposed during COVID, when even the core. So religious liberty is more than just having a right to go to a church and worship. It's right. Practicing one's faith according to one's conscience and moral values in public. That aspect was being cut down. And then during COVID, it was the very heart of it, the right to worship, was being suppressed. So this is my personal experience that leads me to conclude it is an attempt to get control over people's lives.
Let me ask a question.
And our founding fathers understood this. They understood that, and they said that these famous quotes from the likes of John Adams, that our country was made for a religious and moral people. They understood for a democracy to work, it's necessary to have a virtuous citizenry. If it's going to be a self-governing society, each individual must have self-governance for a people to govern themselves. They understood that. And in my effort to free up worship here in San Francisco, at one point, the mayor received a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice citing her for keeping religion shut down while everyone else was able to operate. And they threatened legal action if she didn't treat religion at least as equally. And there's a brilliant letter, but one particular line I'd like to cite that says it all. Sure. It's that the Constitution's unyielding protection for religious worshipers distinguish the United States of America from places dominated by tyranny and despotism. So they understood it was religious freedom, allowing people to practice their faith in public because it instills a sense of virtue, of moral integrity. That's what keeps tyranny from taking over. And because we're seeing a decline in this, we're seeing tyranny taking over.
Yes, and this was really addressing what I was going to ask, which is the basic point: why is religion fundamental to society? And I think you've answered that in the big sense. I also think it's fundamental in a more sort of individual sense, that to have a moral compass, to have an ethical compass, to lead a life that is both meaningful and ethical, it seems to me you need something larger than yourself to aspire to, maybe to guide you. And I think some of us have our own sense of morals and ethics. We know right from wrong. But I think the biggest benefit to me, and I can all full disclosure, I'm not a person who was raised in a religious home, but intellectually, I have been interested in religion and the purpose of religion, the value of religion. And I think that it's very important for people, all people, to have an understanding that they're doing something for a larger cause than themselves. And religion, God, morality, these are very important and essential guideposts to leading one's life appropriately. And I'm very concerned that we don't have those guideposts now. Once you go toward what may be called a secular society, I think you've lost a lot of people who really need a more an anchor like religion. And I think everybody needs an anchor. I'm not just saying people who go to church are the ones who need an anchor, but I think it's very important to the fabric of society. I don't even understand why that has to be argued, frankly, but it is true. Let me sort of finish the last few minutes, because I don't want to take too much of your time with this question. Are you sensing that there's a backlash against those who seem to want to marginalize religion? Is there a resurgence of energy toward religion? I think some of us have seen some of the newest movies that have become popular about Jesus Christ. Some of us have seen some churches reporting a massive inflow of young people that want to worship. What is your sense of that?
I don't know if I would say there's a backlash, but I do see a counter movement. I would call it a counter movement. You mentioned about young people. For the younger generation, I mean, they're highly, as we say, unchurched. They're the nuns, right? They have no religious affiliation. But the ones who do are very serious about it. They want, and they're drawn to more the traditional forms of worship and of belief. They understand the wisdom of it. So I see going forward, there's going to be less and less of sort of a wishy-washy middle, where they kind of go to church sometimes, but kind of believe some things, but not. I've heard young people say that even very recently. They say in our generation, it's all or nothing. They believe seriously and do their best to practice that way, or they're just not interested at all. So this is what I see happening. There's kind of a better definition. It's a small percentage, but it's a clearly identified contingent of young people. And I hope and pray that people of their generation will see that they're living better lives. At the end of the day, they're happier. Their life is harder in some ways, but they're happier because they're living the way God created us to be. He created us for communion, right? He created us to worship Him, and that they'll see that they have something that they want and that they'll draw others. So I see this sort of a counter movement. I don't see it's like a major backlash or uprising, but it's more incremental.
Well, I will take that as a positive because, as I've said many times, and I think you agree, the pandemic exposed a lot of society's problems here. It didn't necessarily create many, but it certainly exposed them.
Yes. Yes.
My view personally is I'm shocked at what we've seen here, sort of an ethical breakdown in the leadership of our country, and that has created really a crisis of trust and a lack of human decency that is very different from when I was a kid and when you were a kid. I think we're sort of the same vintage.
Yes.
So I think the challenge as a country here is to restore that trust and the values that we all want to live in a heterogeneous society based on decency, based on a morality that we thought we used to have here in this country. I'm hoping it can be restored with people like you.
Thank you. Well, that's why it's important for religion to be a part of public life and not marginalized. Like the line from that letter, it's protects us from tyranny. There has to be, you mentioned about, just basic decency and trying to understand other people. One does not have to be a religious believer to understand the value of that. But if the society is deprived of sort of religion being embraced in the society as kind of the influencing cultural factor, then that is going to dissipate. And that's what we're seeing now. Fewer and fewer people believe that. Fewer people believe that they should try to understand someone who has a different point of view. I mean, you're a perfect example of that yourself. You're one of the speakers who's been canceled on a college campus. They won't even bear listening to it. Now, in times past, you didn't have to be a religious believer to try to understand the other person with goodwill, because religion was kind of the primary force forming sort of the moral conscience of the society. Now that that's gone, all these other kind of basic values and social goods that we all agree to, people of our vintage, as you said, those are disappearing now.
Right. Well, we're going to do our best. We don't give up, of course. I know you're a fighter also, because it's just too important, frankly. We don't give up. We keep speaking the truth, and we will keep the dialogue going, certainly here, and I hope to have you back on. Thank you very much, Archbishop Cordileone, for your time. It's always a great honor to speak with you.
Thank you. Likewise for me.
Thanks for listening to Independent Truth with Scott Atlas. If you want to find out more about today's guest, Archbishop of San Francisco Salvatore Cordileone, pay attention to the news, check out his commentary, as well as the website of the Archdiocese of San Francisco. And don't forget to subscribe to this show on YouTube, as well as Spotify, Apple, Google, and anywhere else you're listening to podcasts today. And I'll see you next time.